Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm here with Nicole Barbaro. She is currently a PhD student in Evolutionary Psychology at Oakland University, studying under the advisement of Todd Shackelford, who I already had on the show, in fact. So she serves as the student representative of the Executive Council for the Human Behavior and Evolution Society. She also serves on the Editorial Board as a review editor for Frontiers in Psychology, Evolutionary Psychology, as well as a section editor for the Encyclopedia of Evolutionary Psychological Science. Her interests are in human sexual psychology and behavior, including the application of life history theory and sperm competition theory. So, Nicole, thank you a lot for taking the time to be here with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Okay, so, I've already had a huge lot of evolutionary psychologists on the show, and I've talked about human mating with Dr. David Buss, Todd Shackelford, Glenn Gare, and others. So let me just ask you this first, because it seems that there are several different dimensions to human mating, because there are some general sex differences in terms of mate preferences and mate strategies, and then we have to break it down into short-term and long-term strategies, and there are other issues regarding personality perhaps, but you're interested also in life history theory and attachment theory and attachment style. So how do those two things help us perhaps complement the picture of human mating? We're taking into account all of what I've just said, of course.
Yeah, of course. As you mentioned, human mating is extraordinarily diverse, especially in the research areas that can be covered. My interests, as you mentioned, lie a lot in life history theory. From my perspective, life history theory is a very broad area of study, even within evolutionary psychology itself. For me, I view it as looking at how individuals develop into sexual beings. So we are sexually reproducing species. It's very important. So life history theory tries to look at those kind of that variation in development. So why do some individuals reach sexual maturity much earlier relative to other individuals? Are there relative sex differences between that? So in my area, it's important to understand, the variation in achieving these different life history or reproductive milestones. So upon reaching sexual maturity, when you start being sexually active, age at first birth, those kind of big milestones of human mating. Mm-hmm. And then with attachment theory, for me, I look more at the attachment bonds within romantic attachment and how those develop. So how does your emotional attachment to your romantic partner influence the behaviors that you engage in toward your partner, with your partner, how you feel about your partner?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I guess that in psychology and evolutionary psychology more specifically, because we're dealing with Darwinian processes, we have both variability and also this sort of pan-human nature, let's call it. So, when it comes to that side of things about human universals and psychological universality, let's say, when we're talking about things like life history theory, it seems that when people are exposed to certain particular things during their developmental history, let's say, it seems that we can predict more or less if they will adopt a slow-paced or a fast-paced life history theory or life history strategy. So, how should we approach the interplay here between variability on the one hand and universality on the other? Because it seems that when people are exposed to certain very specific environmental factors or aspects, that they tend to follow predicted strategies that perhaps are somewhat innate. Right.
Yeah, so when we're thinking about the development or those kind of trajectories, there is going to be that human universal component. So we have predictable milestones that pretty much all humans, if you're raised in normative environment, normative circumstances, you're going to hit all those milestones. There's going to be a range at which individuals achieve sexual maturity. Most individuals will start engaging in sexual behavior, form some sort of long-ish term pair bond probably at some point in their life, and have offspring. So there's going to be those kind of predictable milestones. My specific area of interest is kind of that starting point. When or how can we explain that variation in when an individual achieves sexual maturity? So a lot of the research in evolutionary approaches applying life history has focused on that developmental piece, and especially, as you mentioned, those early experiences, how, or in my question, whether those early experiences do have an impact on individuals' timing, specifically in women or girls, because that's typically been the historical focus. So I think it's still a pretty open question of what factors are actually responsible or can explain that variation in terms of those external environmental experiences. If we're looking at how that interplays with those human universals, it's pretty clear that every individual is going to achieve sexual maturity. So that's going to be that universal piece. Why is there a range of anywhere from, a couple years to a few years, depending on where you are in the world, how those circumstances differ. So I think that's still a very open question in evolutionary approaches of what factors and how those factors, if they're applicable, actually do impact variation. So it's an interesting area right now, for sure.
Right. And when it comes to attachment theory and attachment styles, because we have also this huge area that I've been exploring on my show that is behavioral genetics, I would also like to ask you, how do we really disentangle perhaps the genetic and the environmental aspects here? Because I guess that when perhaps people are exposed to a parent or particularly a mother that has a certain style of attachment, perhaps they tend to also adopt that attachment style. But couldn't it also be the case that perhaps the mother or the parents have some genes that predispose for them to develop that attachment style, and then they pass on to their children, and perhaps they also predispose them to develop that attachment style?
Yes, that's with regard to behavioral genetics and attachment theory in particular, it's kind of been the area that I've been focusing on recently. And as you said, that argument that individuals have or passing on genes to their offspring as well as those experiences is exactly the argument that I've been proposing needs to be taken more seriously, specifically within the attachment literature. So behavioral genetics has been around for decades now, and has unambiguously showed that all of our psychological traits that we are most interested in as psychologists are to some degree heritable and typically do demonstrate some moderate heritability. And that is the case for adult attachment in particular. And it seems to be the case also for early infant attachment to parents, though those samples are quite small, so it's still a little bit out for debate on what exactly or how heritable that trait is in the populations that we study. But in the attachment literature in particular, it's a quite interesting area because it spans so many areas of psychology, originally coming out of the traditional developmental tradition, and then being more applied, especially with romantic attachment in the social personality area and the evolutionary area. Surprisingly, though, behavioral genetics has been a very weak focus within attachment theory, even across all those domains. There's only, I think, about 10 studies that I've been able to come across that even looks at behavioral genetics at any stage in development. So what I'm proposing is exactly what we have seen for, very well-studied traits such as cognitive ability or personality traits, that it's not necessarily just the socialization experiences or what's referred to as intergenerational transmission of attachment over time. So if I'm a parent and I'm anxiously, predisposed to have an anxious attachment, then it's going to affect what typically is the mediating factor looked at, my sensitivity to my offspring, and therefore that's going to produce or cause some sort of anxious attachment in my offspring. Whereas, at least in part, it seems pretty uncontroversial in my opinion that the inheritance or the heritability of that attachment orientation is reliably being passed on to offspring, as is the case for pretty much any other psychological trait. So it's definitely an area that, in my view, is lagging behind for the behavioral genetics literature in that area, which is why I've kind of honed in on that area in the last couple of years. So I think it's a big open question. But in terms of the first thing that you asked, which is how we disentangle those things, it depends on how or what level of analysis we're looking at if we want to disentangle the environmental and the genetic part of any trait. So I know you've talked to Lita Cosmides before, and as they have been discussing since their earliest works, all psychology is an interplay between genes and environment, especially when you're looking at that individual level. So my attachment orientation is unambiguously, built by my genetic, my inherited genetic code that builds my brain. It builds the adaptations throughout development, but it's relying on experience or some sort of external input in order to operate properly. When we look at genetic influences versus environmental influences and that kind of terminology, we're looking at groups or populations. So we can get estimates of genetic influences or genetic variation more accurately explaining attachment variation, or environmental variation explaining that attachment variation at the group level. But at an individual level, all of our psychology is an interplay between our genes and environment.
Mm-hmm. Yes, a couple of months ago, David Buss and others published a paper titled something like Learning Context and Environment in Evolutionary Psychology, something like that. So I will have to try and invite one of the authors, because that's really an interesting part of evolutionary psychology that I have yet to explore on my show. So anyway, I've asked you also about behavioral genetics because, I look from a lay person's perspective. I read a lot about these things, but I'm still not an academic. But when I look at evolutionary psychology and behavioral genetics, I really look at them as sort of sister disciplines, because they are interested in more or less the same topics. And even behavioral genetics, it is, in terms of psychology, is one of the most well-developed disciplines, one of the most solid ones scientifically, right? And so I really do think that there's a lot of there should be a good relationship between evolutionary psychology and behavioral genetics, particularly because since behavioral genetics allows for us to sort of know what percentage of a certain behavior comes from the genes or is heritable, then that would also point to Darwinian processes acting upon that same trait, right?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree. The behavioral genetics approaches to understanding any phenotype or any trait that we're interested in, if they're, traits to do with human mating, for instance, I think are very complementary to evolutionary approaches. Now, the general areas, from my understanding, I wasn't born at this time, but from my general understanding, they kind of evolved as disciplines relatively independently from one another. Because one of the, there's a lot of misconceptions with evolutionary psychology, which I'm sure you've gotten into before with discussions with individuals on your show. And similarly with behavioral genetics, because it's a very controversial area even right now. As if you say, something is genetic, then it gets misinterpreted that it's a genetic determinism or something along those lines. And then the slight inaccuracies of phrasing, even I am guilty of this, using genetic influences or environmental influences, when more accurately it's environmental variation and genetic variation explaining other variation in whatever trait. So there's a lot of small nuances that can get kind of tangled up, but overall, when we're trying to understand any trait such as attachment orientations or attachment development, which is what I've been focusing on, I think that evolved approach, that evolutionary psychological approach, can really help understand the function and the selection pressures and all of these the inputs and the outputs of these psychological mechanisms, whereas behavioral genetics also adds that component of how do various sources of, or different sources of variation actually impact the trait that we end up measuring as psychologists. So I think they should be much more integrated than even they are now by evolutionary psychologists and behavioral genetics. Sometimes they can be seen as two independent or somewhat competing areas I've seen. So I think more integration is definitely warranted in this area.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and you were talking about the misconceptions in evolutionary psychology, and I guess that that sort of thing is really annoying because it's been around for several decades and it has been really put forth by very prominent biologists like Stephen Jay Gould and others. And I mean, those sorts of accusations of genetic determinism and that it is all adaptations all the way down and things like, oh, so if it is genetically determined, then we have to go along with the naturalistic fallacy and women have to go back to the kitchen and
there's just a cascade effect of misunderstanding.
Yeah, and that we're all Nazis and I mean
everything terrible.
Yeah, but that's really unfortunate. So anyway, let me just ask you now, what are some of the main kinds of attachment styles that we have?
That's going to depend a lot on who you ask and at what age you're talking about in terms of the person. So when we look at younger individuals, so our classic infant attachment or maternal attachment to your primary caregiver, typically the mother in most of these studies, what's often used is a categorical system. So there's either going to be a secure versus insecure type classification. There's also the three-way or four-way classification. So looking at secure attachment, fearful attachment, disorganized or dismissive. So it's a much more categorical approach as we move to younger ages. There are some more continuous measures, what we typically use in adult samples. When we're looking at adult samples, however, it's pretty well agreed upon at this point that we look at attachment in a dimensional way, similar to how we look at personality traits, so conscientiousness or agreeableness. Our attachment orientations are going to be dimensional, such as those including anxious attachment, or what we would refer to as kind of this hyperactivation of this threat monitoring system for your relationship, or on the other hand, an avoidant attachment, which is, in my view, kind of a hypoactive or kind of indifferent threat monitoring system. So even if there's a threat to your relationship, then there's really no alarm bells going off and you're kind of indifferent, which is associated with lower commitment and, expected things in that way. So typically in adult samples, we look at the dimensional process. In younger samples, we're looking more at a categorical approach.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so would you like perhaps to tell us about a couple of illustrative examples of attachment styles and perhaps how they predispose people to develop their romantic relationships and things like that?
Yeah, so in terms of romantic attachment with anxious attachment, that's going to be more of the area that I'm interested in. I feel like it is more predictive of some of the relationship behaviors that most individuals are interested in, such as jealousy, negative behaviors, which I'm sure we'll get into. And what we mean with anxious attachment, what's been shown is it's typically associated with more chronic jealousy in a relationship. So again, anxiously attached individuals are going to have almost a hyperactive, lots of false alarms going off that there's some sort of threat to my relationship right now. So ambiguous cues, so such as your partner talking to, an individual of perhaps opposite sex that, is just a friendly coworker interaction, for instance, may be interpreted as something more. So there was some great work done in 2013 by Dan Kruger that looked at how anxiously attached individuals who score higher on this dimension are over-interpreting ambiguous cues as a problem or as a threat. Whereas avoidant attachment is going to be a little bit more on the opposite end. So individuals that score higher in this avoidant attachment are going to kind of miss maybe true signals, so kind of false negatives in a way. They tend to be less committed to their romantic relationships. They have more of a wandering eye, keeping an eye out for potentially, as David Buss might call them, backup mates, if you will, to cultivate those backup mates. So we're going to see predictably how those attachment dimensions have implications for partner-directed behaviors, which is one of the areas that I more so look at. So anxious attachment is going to be much more predictive of those kind of negative behaviors because it's a threat system that's going off all the time.
Mm-hmm. So the anxious attachment style is the one that goes more associated with things like relational violence and perhaps resorting to mate guarding strategies and things like that?
Yeah, so that's been the focus of most of my research over the past couple of years, looking at attachment orientations. And what I found is that anxious attachment is very robustly and consistently related to what I refer to as this kind of umbrella of negative partner-directed behaviors. So in one dimension, looking at intimate partner violence across psychological abuse, physical abuse, and sexual coercion or sexual abuse, it's going to be quite robustly related and predictive of individuals being more anxiously attached or more likely to engage in those behaviors. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, it in my opinion, theoretically, it makes perfect sense in that way. So when we look at intimate partner violence or even these negative mate guarding strategies, they're typically in response to some perceived threat. So from an evolutionary theoretical approach, these behaviors have a function, if you will, that perhaps from a male perspective, there's cues that my partner may be cheating on me or having sexual relations with someone else. Maybe from a classic female perspective, oh, they're spending time with other people or diverting those emotional or material resources away from the mateship. So this anxious attachment is going to set off those alarm bells and kind of be that mediating factor that may motivate these behaviors that are designed from an evolutionary perspective to solve these adaptive problems. So I find it quite complementary in that way to classic evolutionary approaches to intimate partner violence and mate guarding, which have been more male-centered. I think the attachment theory allows it to be a more gender-neutral kind of approach to understanding why men and women both perpetrate these negative partner-directed behaviors. So it's a little more less gender specific than some traditional evolutionary approaches in this area.
Mm-hmm. And when we're talking about mate guarding, what are some of the main types of strategies that people resort to?
So I like to break it up in a way of what we call benefit provisioning and cost inflicting mate retention strategies. So this is going to be a little bit different than the original kind of breaking or kind of dimensionality of these mate guarding strategies that David Buss proposed. He, in the original studies, broke it up into intersexual, so behaviors geared towards individuals of the opposite sex versus intrasexual, or behaviors geared towards people of the same sex as you. The benefit provisioning and cost inflicting are going to serve a little bit different functions, and they seem to have some more, in my opinion, interesting correlations or associations with the behaviors that I'm interested in, or their predictors, such that benefit provisioning are going to be all those nice things that you do for your partner. You buy them gifts, you tell them you love them, you know, all the nice things that hopefully most of us are doing to our romantic partners. And those are going to be ways to, let's hypothesize, is to increase the partner satisfaction. So they like being in the relationship with you, and therefore they're going to stay in a relationship with you. Whereas cost inflicting are going to be more of those negative partner directed behaviors, such as kind of manipulation or manipulative type behaviors, some of the more aggressive type behaviors that we hope we're not doing and our partners aren't doing to us, but typically are quite natural in a lot of human mateships to be a little more conniving and negative. So what we see with these kind of mate retention strategies is predictably those more cost-inflicting are going to be kind of predecessors of more traditional intimate partner violence. They're going to be more predictive of that anxious attachment is going to be more predictive of those cost-inflicting strategies, have a stronger association with those. So breaking it up into that benefit provisioning and cost-inflicting seems to be, in my view, a nice way to break up those strategies to look at them in terms of how different predictors predict these different types of outcomes.
Mm-hmm. And the more violent strategies are the ones that are related to all things related to domestic violence and sexual coercion and homicide and perhaps even rape, right?
Yeah. So what's interesting is the paper I just published in December, so it's quite recent, was looking at attachment orientations to specific partners and specifically sexual coercion outcomes in relationships. Now, a review study was just conducted, I think it was 2016, looking at attachment predicting sexual coercion. So what is often found is when you read through this literature outside of the evolutionary area, especially, sees that avoidant attachment tends to be more predictive of what we call sexual assault or sexual coercion, which I always found quite odd, theoretically. And the general argument is that avoidant attachment is associated with this lack of empathy for your partner. Therefore, you're more likely to perpetrate these violent acts towards your partner because of this kind of lack of empathy or disinterest in your partner. I always thought that seemed a little backwards from theoretical perspectives, especially with evolutionary psychology, that it's, a functional response to a threat. Anxious attachment theoretically should be more associated with those threat responses. So digging into, this is what we addressed in this 2018 paper in December, was maybe there's some issues with how we're measuring these things, as there are in a lot of psychological studies, that avoidant attachment, or attachment more generally, when it's measured in romantic relationships, is kind of generalized into this style, these attachment styles. So how do you respond to romantic partners? Well, I think every relationship can be quite different in many ways. So I think evaluating how you're attached to partners in general may not be the most accurate. It might be a little noisy. So in our studies, we typically find individuals that are currently in a relationship and ask them specifically, how do you relate to your partner, this specific partner? And then in terms of the outcomes, this intimate partner violence or sexual coercion, we look at what have you done in this specific relationship. And when you take those two things into account, those simple kind of measurement, you see that avoidant attachment isn't very predictive of these outcomes, and anxious attachment is quite robustly and consistently related to intimate partner violence, more specifically sexual coercion, that we looked at in this recent study. So I think focusing that measurement is a big issue across different domains in psychology.
Mm-hmm. So we're talking about mate guarding strategies, mm-hmm. but on a more general level, what are the sorts of behavior coming from the partner that really trigger or tend to invoke strategies of mate guarding in the other partner?
Mm-hmm. So this is where the evolutionary approach, kind of pioneered by David Buss in these classic studies in EP, have really informed my investigation of these topics. So in one of them, one of the studies that I've looked at, kind of looking at more of a mechanistic, aspect or mediating factor that is facilitating that association between attachment and these negative mate guarding or intimate partner violence strategies, is perceived infidelity. So in my view, the adult or romantic attachment system is designed, or its evolutionary function is to monitor and regulate threats to the mateship, the person that you're attached to. And in an evolutionary sense, what are those big threats to a relationship? Either an intersexual partner, or any sort of cues that the mate may leave you in terms of protection and provisioning. So this is where that classic evolutionary approach comes in. We're monitoring threats to the pair bond either by other intersexual rivals, or just the mere fact that your partner doesn't want to be in a relationship with you and may just leave. So in our study that we just published, I think it just came out this year, we looked at those perceptions of infidelity and how those relate to these various attachment dimensions, and whether those perceptions, those threats to the pair bond, those perceived threats, are going to influence and predict those behaviors. And predictably, what we found is that anxious attachment is positively associated with greater perceptions of infidelity. So again, that threat monitoring system going off, and then that perception mediates that association between the attachment and mate guarding strategies. Whereas avoidant attachment, we found a very weak relationship between avoidant attachment and perceptions of infidelity, which again makes sense if the individual is kind of indifferent or a hypoactive or underactive threat monitoring system. It's not going to, ring any alarm bells of perceived threats, and therefore that relationship, that mediational relationship, wasn't found with avoidant attachment, only anxious attachment.
Mm-hmm. And after the relationship has ended, people also can resort to certain strategies like, for example, stalking, harassment, and things like that, right?
Yeah, so this area I haven't personally looked at, but as I'm sure David Buss has talked about in many talks, and perhaps with you as well, that typically that stalking is going to be more focused on a male strategy in order to, again, it's almost like a extreme mate guarding of, if I am causing enough distress for you and making sure other males or other potential suitors don't want to be around because I'm stalking you, then it's in a way a direct, what we call direct guarding, as keeping other rivals away from your ex-partner. So stalking is definitely, I could see, kind of falling under that umbrella.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, when it comes to mate retention strategies, there are three main types, right? Individual ones, coalitional ones, and also what you call in-pair copulation frequency. So could you tell us first perhaps about coalitional mate retention? Because that's really a thing that I haven't yet talked about in my show. So.
Yeah, that's coalitional mate retention is kind of a new concept. This is one of the first studies that I worked on as a graduate student with Dr. Shackelford, and then also with his previous PhD student, Michael Pham, came up with this idea of what we call coalitional mate guarding. So in a way, humans are quite unique, especially in modern environments, with how we keep our mateships around. So in many ways, we spend a lot of time away from our partner, which in kind of more of the broader animal kingdom, or even perhaps in ancestral times, we didn't spend nearly as much time away. So we have individuals that are in relationships that are on different continents, for example. So it's pretty hard to employ what we call these individual mate retention strategies, or these classic mate retention strategies that Buss developed, in terms of it's hard to directly guard your partner if you're 1,000 miles away from them. So we came up with this idea of perhaps what are these different strategies that people may report, roping in close allies or friends to help guard their partner or help retain their partner. So this idea of coalitional mate retention is essentially the idea of asking or requesting a close friend or ally to keep an eye on our partner, or perform these mate retention behaviors that we can't perform ourselves, assuming they're not in the area. So asking for relationship advice of, hey, my partner and I got in a fight, what do you think I can do to help solve that problem that arose? Or if you're not at a social gathering but your friend is, they do the direct guarding for you, if you will. So that's the idea behind this coalitional mate retention, and it's relatively new. I believe we're the only lab group that's done studies on this, so it's still a brand new area that is definitely in need of some more replication and more studies more broadly outside of our own lab, but it's an interesting phenomenon to look at.
Right. And do we already know if there are any major sex differences in terms of strategies of coalitional mate retention? Because, I mean, when we think about sex differences, men, in terms of threats, men tend to be more physically threatening, and women tend to resort to strategies that are perhaps more social or verbal or communicative or something like that. So do we know something about that applied to coalitional mate retention?
We know a little bit. I'm hesitant to say how confident I am in the findings, because it's only one or two studies that we've actually collected data on. But something that we have found in terms of sex differences, because remember, with coalitional mate retention, you can ask either a same-sex or an opposite-sex friend to help you in various domains. So one sex difference, which probably is not very surprising and probably will replicate in future studies, is that men tend to ask their female friends for relationship advice, what we call this relationship therapy aspect, which ties in with that kind of emotional aspect. If we think about the qualities of female friendships, typically they're more emotionally intimate or more one-on-one. So that's one of those sex differences that we found, that men tend to ask their female friend rather than their male friend for relationship advice to smooth things over, if you will. But I would say right now, most of the sex differences that we found are quite preliminary, just because we only have, I think, 2 or 3 data sets on this behavior. So I don't want to make any broad strokes generalizations quite yet.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so are there any types of people, or perhaps personality types, that tend to resort to coalitional mate retention more frequently? I know that in one of your papers you talk about dishonest individuals, that they tend to resort to these strategies more often. So could you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's one of the studies that we looked at. We looked at the Hexaco personality inventory. So it's kind of the expanded Big Five inventory that adds in this factor of honesty, humility, which is essentially how deceitful or kind of manipulative you are in certain ways. So what we found with the personality measures and our coalitional mate retention, how often individuals are requesting these coalitional mate retention behaviors from their friends, is we saw overall that seems to be honesty, humility is associated with more requests. So the kind of less honest, more dishonest, or more duplicitous you are as an individual, you're more likely to employ or request these coalitional mate retention behaviors from your friend. Now, if we look at what, as we interpreted it, at least what we can see is coalitional mate retention is itself kind of an inherently duplicitous act. So you are asking someone else to kind of spy on your partner or get information from your partner rather than directly communicating yourself. So it seems to be a finding that I'm interested to see in other samples to see whether this effect replicates, but it seems to be that there may be this inherently dishonest quality to coalitional mate retention in the first place that isn't necessarily the same as it is for individual mate retention. So I'm going to be curious to see how that replicates across different samples as well.
Right. Okay, so back in 2016, you published a study, a paper titled The Big Five Personality Dimensions and Mate Retention Behaviors in Iran. So this was done on a sample of people from Iran, right? So could you tell us about the results that you got there, and perhaps if since then anyone has done the same kind of study with other populations?
So in terms of mate retention or individual mate retention personality traits, this was a study that was led by Mohammed Atari, which was our collaborator at the time. He was still in Iran. I believe he's at University of Southern California now. But he really helped us out of replicating a lot of this mate retention work and looking at it in a very different population than the typical US populations that we have. Now with personality, what's interesting about this area, and we report in that paper as well, there have been some cross-cultural studies on this, but what we're finding is that the personality, at least in my view, the personality trait associations with mate retention are variable across these different studies. The one consistent finding that we seem to find in our study and in these other studies on mate retention and personality seems to be this idea of neuroticism being associated with what we call these cost-inflicting mate retention strategies. That seems to be a consistent and reliable finding compared to the other personality dimensions. What's interesting about this finding is that when we look at, kind of bringing it back to attachment, when we look at the relationship between attachment anxiety and personality traits, there is a huge correlation between attachment anxiety and neuroticism. So this kind of high anxious kind of general personality trait is also kind of spilling over into these attachment bonds. So when we look at these consistent relationships between attachment anxiety and these cost-inflicting behaviors, to me it's quite unsurprising that we also see this consistent relationship between neuroticism, which has big overlap with attachment anxiety, and these cost-inflicting mate retention behaviors as well. But other dimensions seem to be quite variable in terms of their association. Some areas are positive, some negative. I'm not really sure why the relationships are so different cross-culturally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, and trait neuroticism from the Big Five goes very associated with things like anxiety, depression, mental rumination, and things like that. So yeah. I guess that it makes sense for people to really be perhaps too obsessed with what is happening in their relationship or something like that.
Seems like neuroticism focused in on your partner specifically rather than more general life domains.
Yeah, because people also tend to experience more negative emotion and to be more pessimistic, and perhaps they think that perhaps their relationship is not as solid as they would like to be, and perhaps the partner will go away eventually and things like that, right? That
fear of abandonment and rejection is a big kind of defining quality of that anxious attachment, which, as you mentioned, neuroticism is associated with what we would traditionally call mood disorder, so depression, general anxiety disorder, and things like that. So I think, at least for my general kind of approach I'm taking of attachment and mate retention, it bodes quite well for my approach personally, at least.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I know a lot about that because I'm high in neuroticism. So
I think a lot of researchers are, scientific types are, absolutely.
Yeah, perhaps that's what makes them really focus on details and be obsessive about something.
It probably definitely helps, at least in part, for sure.
Yeah, right. Okay, so just one last question, or a last topic at least.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the role between the role of marriage and children in romantic attachment. So when people get married and after when they have children, what happens in terms of how they feel attached to their partner, let's say?
That's a great question. It's definitely something that I think is not looked at enough in evolutionary approaches, is that transitional point. And what is really needed to understand kind of these transitional life stages in terms of having children is, as kind of coming back to the beginning, is a characteristic, life history milestone that almost all humans go through. And I don't think there's enough research on it. The one area that I focused on a couple years ago was looking at how mate retention effort differs between individuals with kids and individuals without kids. Now, this is just kind of a quasi-group study. We didn't obviously manipulate having children or anything, and it wasn't longitudinal. But what we did find was that the individuals that had children with their romantic partner versus individuals that currently did not have any children with their partner tended to report engaging in more frequent mate retention behaviors. Now, of course, there could be pre-existing group differences of why this may be the case, which is why a longitudinal study would be the best way to get at this. But if we tie this into this idea that attachment or mate retention is going to be a kind of outcome, a primary outcome of this attachment system, which is a position that I'm proposing, that what we might expect is that with children, we would see, or what I predict would be seeing an increase in kind of this anxious attachment, or the threat monitoring system of your pair bond may increase at the time of having kids. Now, why might this be the case? Well, if we have children, the potential risks or the costs of your relationship ending, especially in those first few years where ancestrally the infant and the mother would be both very vulnerable, that it would make good evolutionary sense to be on kind of heightened alert after that transition, especially for women, because at that time, that male provisioning, if the male decides to leave the relationship, that male provisioning may go down, which depending on where you are in the world can be very important for child outcomes, but not always. But also that threat of violence from other unrelated males, especially with a nursing or very vulnerable infant. So those could be potential kind of the threats or the cost to the relationship are going to increase at that time. So I would suspect that attachment anxiety may also increase. But for men, there's still also going to be that potential cost just from threats of violence from other men toward that infant, or the potential reproductive costs of having an infant not survive. So overall, if we were to do a longitudinal study, I would predict that increase in attachment anxiety, which I think pregnancy and parenting, those transitions are kind of generally understudied areas in evolutionary psychology. So I think it'd be really useful to go that direction.
Right. And isn't it also the case that particularly when men get married and when they have children, their blood levels of testosterone tend to go down, and perhaps they get into a strategy of devoting more of their investment in the relationship and in their children, instead of trying to go and look for other mates or something like that?
Yes, that does appear to be the case, that it can be very reproductively advantageous for men to put their effort into, not necessarily even parenting effort to that particular offspring, but mate guarding effort to that particular partner and their offspring. So there's kind of two directions that men can go. They have a little bit more flexibility in their strategies. Is that one, they can, very reproductively advantageous to mate guard that one particular female and make sure those offspring are surviving. What's been found too is that investing partners can reduce the time inter-birth ratio, so women can actually produce more offspring if they have that social support, the fathers being one potential source of that social support. So men, if they're putting their effort into provisioning and mate guarding, can actually increase their reproductive output within that one particular partner. So it can be very advantageous in that way, with that drop in testosterone perhaps mediating that effect. on the other hand, as you mentioned, some men may go more of the mating effort route and simply try to increase reproductive output with multiple partners. But it's not necessarily one strategy is better than the other. It's going to depend on that ecology, depend on where you are in the world, and depend on those personal factors that may influence that. But generally, the mate guarding strategy can be very advantageous for men, reproductively speaking.
Yeah, and I mean, in our species, we have this generalized pair bonding mating strategy also because our children or our infants also go through these long periods of dependency that perhaps are the longest in all of the species that we know about, right? So parental investment on the side of the father is also crucial, or at least it was during most of our evolutionary history, in order for people to really reproduce successfully, right?
Yeah, it depends. In terms of paternal investment, it really does depend. So Rebecca Sears done some great work in this area showing that, at least with provisioning, so the male provisioning hypothesis more generally suggests that the reason that pair bonding may have evolved, or the reason that we tend to gravitate towards these more pair bonding, stable monogamish type structures, is because male provisioning in terms of calories and resources have helped children survive because we're so dependent as offspring or as very young infants. But I'm a little skeptical of that hypothesis because, one, the male investment or male provisioning or even male parental care is quite variable cross-culturally. So in typical Western environments, we have this idea of the nuclear family, or as mom and father, and paternal investment by all measures does have positive effects for offspring in our environment. But as Rebecca Sear has shown in her cross-cultural work, that fathers, depending on where you are in the world, don't really have that big of an effect, at least provisionally speaking. So what matters more is perhaps that general social support network, or this kind of alloparenting. Sarah Hardy's idea of alloparenting is going to be very important. So this male provisioning hypothesis, I'm a little skeptical of whether that is the driving force behind pair bonds. But do I think that men have a very important role to play in terms of the evolution of pair bonds? Absolutely. I just think it's more on the protection side, or that infanticide avoidance aspect, that is more so that original driving force behind why we form pair bonds. So slightly different, but it's more of a male protection rather than male provisioning, which I think cross-culturally might pan out to be a little more accurate, and at least has been in terms of primate studies.
Mm-hmm. So preventing infanticide in the sense that the man is there to protect the children from being killed by other men that could approach that female or that woman to try to have sexual intercourse with her or something like that, and then to have children with her, and not investing in those children that come from other men, right?
Yeah, so that protection allows a few things, from my understanding, is this is what's been shown, or at least been suggested, especially across primates, including humans, of course, but across primate species, is that primates do tend to have very high rates of infanticide compared to other mammals. So that male protection is very advantageous for especially nursing mothers to have that protection. And what that protection allows, again, is for both men and women to increase their reproductive output, assuming ancestral environment. So that male protection allows women to wean their offspring perhaps sooner and have a higher number of offspring, which is also advantageous for that man, which is why that mate guarding strategy of one woman can be quite advantageous, because if you're protecting that woman and protecting that offspring, not necessarily a provisioning way, but it can increase that reproductive output for both individuals. So I think it really depends, because sometimes that that protection is lumped into male provisioning. But I think Kristen Hawk's work, especially, which has influenced me a lot, has clearly demonstrated that protection by males and provisioning by males are two things that we need to be careful to disentangle, because they might have different effects. So I think it's, again, an open area, but I think the psychological community likes the male provisioning hypothesis because one sounds nicer than infanticide does. So I think the male provisioning hypothesis receives much more interest rather than infanticide. It's also easier to measure as well. So I think there's some other factors that are kind of contributing to the pushing of that male provisioning hypothesis. But I would like to propose that we take a better look at the role of infanticide and pair bonding and male protection.
So perhaps cooperative breeding would play more of a role in terms of provisioning, and perhaps other people participating in weaving the child, like for example grandmothers and perhaps other people that are part of the extended family. Right?
Yeah, I think that definitely deserves more support, but a lot of the research on families is done in modern Western environments where this very non-normative nuclear family is kind of the norm, the 2 parents and 2.5 kids in a very, large, unnecessarily large house most of the times. I don't think that's necessarily reflective of our ancestral state. What I think is more so occurring is this general provisioning from alloparenting as kind of the ancestral state. But when applied in a Western environment where you have just the 2 parents in a household, the fathers in this Western environment are playing that role of what would traditionally be most often female alloparents in an ancestral environment. So if we're measuring the effects of fathers in modern Western environments, it seems that we're going to see an effect, and that seems to be the case coming full circle to, sexual maturation, that fathers play an important role. But once you go outside of, these traditionally weird countries, you see no effects of fathers on these outcomes that we see in, say, the US and the UK, which is an indicator to me that we need to look more broadly at this alloparental investment rather than father investment. And that father investment may just be how it's manifesting in this modern Western environment, but it's not necessarily the ancestral state.
Mm-hmm. But related to that, isn't it also the case that perhaps a confounding factor in modern industrialized societies would be that people tend to move quite a lot away from their parents' house and to constitute their own families, perhaps far away from where their parents live, and perhaps that would be another reason why cooperative breeding doesn't play much of a role as perhaps it has played during our evolutionary history in our current environments, let's say.
Exactly. That's exactly the point. Yes, exactly. So when in an ancestral environment, typically, there's grandmothers or other, close female relatives, for instance, aunts and things like that, and you lived around your family and maybe close friends, for instance, but now in our modern environment, if you become quite secluded, or it's quite easy to become quite secluded from your traditional family structure. So if all that alloparental effort now has to be funneled into just the 2 parents, I think that's why we're seeing such dramatic effects of fathering in particular in U.S. Studies, for example, rather than effects of grandmothers and aunts and other female relatives, simply because they're not there. They're not in close proximity. So that proximity is definitely going to play a massive factor, and the modern environments are kind of changing those input parameters to our offspring raising psychological system, if you will. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Oh, so that's very interesting. And the part you referred about the US, so that perhaps would be a factor that plays a role in the fact that perhaps we get those studies where if children live in a fatherless house, that they tend to develop certain developmental issues and go down a negative path in their lives and things like that.
Exactly. So this is one area of research that I've been kind of focusing on, and others, including Rebecca Sear, have been focusing on recently as well, is in evolutionary psychology, especially with life history and sexual maturation of girls. One of the hypotheses that have been proposed back in the 80s was this father absence idea. So if children grow up in a household without a father, it's a cue of a lack of investment or a risky environment, and therefore it's advantageous to accelerate development and achieve sexual maturity earlier because you're in a more dangerous, less resource-rich environment. So if you mature earlier, you can kind of get to the reproduction faster. And evolutionary speaking, that would be quite advantageous. Now, most of the studies, a meta-analysis was published in 2013 in the journal Evolutionary Psychology, found that there is a relatively reliable association between father absence and earlier pubertal maturation in girls. The problem that Rebecca Sear pointed out with her paper that was just published, I think, last month on this association between father absence and pubertal maturation in non-weird countries. So she basically took all the data that hasn't been done in the US and found no reliable association between that father absence and accelerated reproductive development. So it does seem to be a consequence of kind of this weird environment where in a traditional or I guess non-traditional Western environment where we have this kind of idea of the nuclear family, which is not ancestrally accurate, is going to, the fathers are going to play that role because they're the other primary investing adult into that offspring. You take them away and there are probably going to be some negative effects. Ancestrally speaking, is it necessarily the father or is it a cue of general investment that typically came from alloparents seems to be more reliably the case. So again, you go to non-weird environments and the father absence hypothesis doesn't pan out and doesn't appear to pan out. So I think there's definitely more going on besides just the father itself. It seems to be more a general alloparental support that seems to be the driving factor.
Mm-hmm. And all of these factors that we're talking about are the ones that perhaps predispose then children and adolescents to adopt what we call a fast-paced life history strategy, right? And perhaps the things associated with more risky behavior and teenage pregnancies and obesity and things like that, correct?
Yeah, and that's going to kind of drive into another hypothesis or an alternative for this father absence idea that my colleagues and I have proposed back in 2017 was that perhaps there's just general genetic confounding going on here, that individuals that are less likely to remain in stable pair bonds, so they're more likely to have unstable relationships, shorter term relationships, are simply just passing on genes that also facilitate faster reproductive development and this quote unquote faster life history strategy as well. So there's overall, I find this area very exciting because we've had this father absence hypothesis around for decades now, and it's been very, this is clear cut, this is very important, has spanned so many research programs and so much interest, and in the past 2 years it seems to be kind of crumbling. The infrastructure of the hypothesis seems to be crumbling, which is more generally the case in psychology right now anyways, as a lot of long-standing truths are just crumbling with more data. So whether it's just a weird phenomenon that father absence is causing earlier reproduction is interesting of itself. Is it perhaps a genetic confounding issue? We did some modeling that suggests perhaps that's the case. Some other research has come out saying, no, we don't think that's true. I'm working on a project right now to kind of get at that a little bit more clearly with some twin data. So there's a lot of options on the table, which makes it an exciting area of research for me. So we'll see what pans out over the next few years, hopefully.
Yeah, I guess that's bad news for the conservatives, I guess.
Right.
that thing about yeah. Okay, so just before we go, would you like perhaps to tell people what are some of the best places on the internet if they want to get in touch with your work?
Sure. So I do have a website, just NicoleBarbaro.com, that has all my publications on it, all my teaching courses and everything on it. So that's going to be kind of the main hub where you can find all my scientific work, if you will. Everything's available for download there. If you want to get in touch with me in a more casual setting, find me on Twitter, at Nicole Barbaro. So it's quite simple across all these different domains. But my Twitter is where I'm the most active, and you can kind of interact with me and see my thoughts on more varied research areas.
Okay, so I will be leaving links to all of that in the description box of the interview, so people go check that out. And Nicole, thank you again for taking the time to be here with us today. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show. So
absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. This was a great time.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics from a variety of fields. So just to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. If you don't like Patreon, you can also do it via PayPal and Subscribestar. Yeah, all of the links will be in the description box. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my Patreons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Perel Galarson, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelina, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condreanu, Jana Enninen, and my first producer, Isar Weber. Thank you for all.